October 12, 1941. The night air over Moscow reeked of burning oil and cold metal. Steam hissed from the locomotive as black smoke drifted through the dim station lights. Along the tracks, hundreds of freight cars stood loaded to the brim, not with passengers but with the beating heart of Soviet industry. Machine tools, engine blocks, half-built tanks, and crates of blueprints were being strapped down by grease-covered workers. Soldiers shouted orders over the metallic clatter of cranes. The German advance had breached deep into Soviet territory, and Moscow itself now trembled under the threat of encirclement. The Soviet Union was tearing itself apart. Voluntarily, Joseph Stalin's government had issued a desperate decree. Evacuate all strategic industry to the east. It wasn't a suggestion. It was survival. Under the cover of night, entire factories vanished. Plants from Leningrad, Kharkov, and Stalingrad were dismantled bolt by bolt. Their skeletons loaded onto trains bound for the Ural Mountains, a land far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe's bombers. The convoys stretched for miles across frozen steppes. Workers rode inside open wagons wrapped in blankets, beside lathes and tank turrets that once roared in Europe's largest cities. Among them was the pride of Soviet armor production, the Kharkov Locomotive Works, builder of the T-34 tank. Their destination? A remote industrial outpost near Chelyabinsk. No one called it Tankograd yet. At that moment, it was just a windswept patch of earth surrounded by forests, snow, and silence. But in Stalin's mind, it was the future of the Red Army. As the trains rattled eastward, engineers hunched over makeshift tables, sketching blueprints by lantern light. They whispered about the Germans, how they'd captured Kiev, how they were bombing Smolensk, how Moscow might be next. Yet none of them turned back because the order was clear. Rebuild the factories. Restart production. Do not stop. When the first trains reached Chelyabinsk, the workers saw little more than a scattering of half-built sheds and a few smokestacks rising from the snow. The bitter Ural wind sliced through their coats. There were no proper roads, no warm housing, no power grids capable of supporting the enormous task ahead. But within hours the unloading began. Steam cranes swung into motion. A foreman named Mikhail Volkov shouted over the noise, "Unload the presses. We start welding tonight." In a land of frozen mud, the Soviets were about to build the world's largest tank factory. From nothing. The engineers began erecting buildings before the last train had even arrived. They worked under floodlights through the night, sleeping in tents using railway ties for fuel. Each machine tool was installed as soon as it came off the flat car. There was no waiting for completion. Production and construction merged into one. Within weeks, the ground rumbled again, but this time, not from trains. It was from test engines. The first workshops were already producing components for the T-34. Sparks flew against the night. Skaya's welders worked in shifts so relentless they barely knew whether it was day or night. Tankograd was beginning to breathe, but the Germans were closing in on Moscow and winter was coming. Every delay could mean disaster for the Soviet front. Stalin demanded results now, and in Chelyabinsk, men and women who had never built a tank before were learning to do so with their bare hands. The Ural Mountains had become the last fortress of Soviet industry. And from this desolate place, the Red Army's armor would soon roar back to life. November 3, 1941. Chelyabinsk, Ural Mountains. Temperature, 28 degrees. The wind howled like a living thing across the barren factory yard. Snow drifted around scaffolding and skeletal beams as welders worked by the yellow glow of floodlights. Sparks scattered across the frost-bitten ground, hissing like angry insects. Inside a drafty assembly hall, a hall that barely had walls, workers crowded around a gigantic casting press. Its metal surface still bore chalk marks from its former life in Kharkov, before the factory had been dismantled and loaded onto trains. A teenage worker named Marina Petrova tightened her scarf against the cold as she fed a sheet of steel into the press. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. She had been here for 27 hours. The press slammed down with a thunderous chung. Engineers erupted into cheers. They didn't even wait for the cracked glass to stop rattling in the nearby window frames. The machine worked. That meant they could finally shape T-34 armor plates at Chelyabinsk. A grizzled engineer named Andrei Stepanovich slapped the side of the press with a grin. That's one step closer to giving the Germans hell. Workers laughed, then immediately got back to work. There was no time to celebrate. Every hour mattered. The Soviet front was collapsing, and the only way to stop it was to flood the battlefield with tanks. The city that didn't exist on any map within weeks, Chelyabinsk, had become unrecognizable. New workshops rose out of the frozen earth like steel giants. Unlike the elegant industrial complexes of Germany or the United States, Tankograd was brute efficiency, long crude cathedrals of metal frames and sheet steel. Walls were assembled while the machinery inside them was already running. On the eastern side of the complex, a locomotive factory's smokestacks blasted black smoke against the white sky. On the western side, workers dug trenches for power lines by hand, using pickaxes that bounced off permafrost. A new sign appeared at the gate. CHTZ, Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant. But everyone ignored the letters. They called it Tankograd. Tank City. And the name stuck. Women, children, and prisoners of war. December, the workforce swelled to over 40,000 people. Many were not trained machinists. They were tractor operators from villages, women from Leningrad who escaped the siege, teenagers evacuated from schools, prisoners sentenced to labor. They worked side by side under portraits of Stalin. Propaganda banners hung from the rafters. A tank built today saves lives tomorrow. Marina pulled a lever on a turret welding arm while an elderly woman next to her, Valentina, hammered rivets into place. They didn't speak much. Words wasted breath they didn't have. Valentina wiped sweat from her brow. We used to grow wheat. Now we grow steel. When a foreman shouted for volunteers to run an overnight shift, half the workers raised their hands. The other half were either unconscious from fatigue or already on another shift. Even meals were built for war. The cafeteria served watery cabbage soup and black bread so dense it could be used as a brick. Workers joked that the bread was bulletproof, then stopped joking because the bread actually bounced when dropped. Nevertheless, they ate fast and returned to the floor. Outside, a snowstorm swallowed the factory in white noise. Inside, Tankograd roared. First completed T-34 on January 20th, 1942. After 2 months of non-stop labor, weld teams cleared space around Assembly Line 3. A foreman raised his hand. Every machine in the hall shut down at once. Silence settled like dust. There, resting on newly laid tracks, the first T-34 tank produced entirely at Chelyabinsk. Green paint gleamed under the floodlights. Weld seams were rough, imperfect, and even ugly, but solid. Marina placed her hand on the cold armor. "It feels alive," she whispered. The foreman barked, "Fuel it." Diesel sloshed into the tank's side intake. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. The tank lurched forward, belching smoke, and then, as if impatient to get to the front, crashed through the improvised factory doors, shattering planks. Workers erupted in cheers. Anton, a test driver, swung himself onto the tank's turret. "Make way. The Germans are waiting." Snow exploded from beneath the tank's tracks as it disappeared into the white night. Tankograd had done it. The shift never ends, but there was no pause. No celebration. No rest. Because a message arrived from Moscow that same night. Increased production. Triple output. Every tank must be completed faster. The war wasn't asking for tanks, the war was devouring them. Workers tightened their belts. Machine tools screamed through the night. At Chelyabinsk, sleep was a luxury, and victory was measured in units of steel and blood. Tankograd was officially the beating industrial heart of Soviet survival. March 15, 1942. Chelyabinsk, Tankograd. The earth shook. Not from artillery. Not here, not this far east. This thunder was coming from inside the design hall of Workshop 12, where Soviet engineers were preparing something that had never existed before. Sergei Ginsburg, chief engineer of the plant, stood with a rolled blueprint under his arm as the steel doors of the design hangar slammed shut behind him. Around him, the cavernous room smelled of warm oil, acetylene, and burning welding rods. A massive banner hung from the rafters. "We build victory." Ginsberg adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at the long drafting table where two blueprints lay side by side. On the left, the familiar silhouette of the T-34. On the right, a bulky, brutal machine, larger, heavier, the prototype for a new tank, the KV-1 heavy tank. The KV-1 wasn't elegant. It was a brawler. It was intended to shrug off German shells and keep firing. "We are not building a tank," Ginsberg murmured to his lead machinist, Ivan Chernov. "We are building a fist." Ivan grinned, revealing soot-stained teeth. "A fist big enough to punch Berlin." Testing the beast in the test yard outside, a skeletal KV-1 chassis sat under a tarpaulin. Snow piled around its sides. A test crew climbed into the vehicle, 4 men in quilted jackets and fur-lined helmets. Their breath fogged in the freezing air. The test driver, a burly man named Pasha Koltsov, slapped the side of the armor. "Make her scream," he said, climbing into the hatch. Behind him, Marina, promoted now, responsible for turret welding inspections, watched the engine installation crew wheel over the V2 diesel engine. The engine was originally designed for fast tractors. Now Tankograd was pushing it to the limit, modifying it, reinforcing it, trying to tame horsepower out of a design never meant to move a 45-ton tank. The crew bolted the engine into place. Pasha flipped the starter. The beast coughed. Then it roared, smoke blasting through the frosted exhaust pipes. A wave of heat pushed outward. The test yard smelled like diesel, hot metal, and victory. Pasha slammed the throttle. The KV-1 lurched forward, crushing a wooden pallet under its treads. Snow shot into the air as the tank clawed across the icy ground and plowed straight through a stack of oil drums, flattening them like paper cups. Ginsberg laughed like a madman. "We'll send these to the front before the Germans can blink." But the victory was short-lived. The tank sputtered. The engine wheezed, coughed, and died. The entire yard fell silent. Pasha popped out of the hatch, waving a wrench at the engineers. "She needs stronger transmission or so she'll die on her first hill." Ginsberg didn't panic. He just pointed to the tank and said, "Fix it, faster." Because every hour meant another kilometer the Germans pushed east, factory life. Relentless and unforgiving, inside Workshop 5. Welders stitched heavy armor plates together, sparks lighting their faces like fireflies. The crews rotated in shifts of 6 hours, but the truth was nobody really counted. Time didn't mean anything anymore, and only numbers did. Tanks per day. Operating turrets. Engines completed. A poster near the tool crib read, "Work is life. Idleness is death." Some workers slept beneath assembly tables. Others used crates as beds, curling into themselves like exhausted animals. Valentina, older, slower now, fought to keep her eyes open as she lined up a weld seam on a turret ring. Marina touched her shoulder. "Take a moment. Drink water." Valentina shook her head. "What if that turret ends up on the tank that saves my son at the front?" Marina didn't argue. A few yards away, prisoners in gray uniforms worked with armed guards standing behind them. Political detainees, former factory owners, petty criminals, all of them producing the machinery of war. Their hands bled from cold metal. Their eyes were hollow. Yet when a guard yelled, "Weld faster," they kept moving, because Tankograd did not stop. The night production pushed that night. Floodlights bathed the assembly hall in harsh white light. The plant speakers buzzed to life, and the voice of the production director echoed overhead. "Tonight we reach 40 tanks a day." Gasps rippled through the floor. 40? The previous record was 30. Ivan wiped sweat from his brow. "They're trying to kill us." Ginsberg heard him and smiled bitterly. "No, they're trying to kill Germans." At midnight, the KV-1 prototype rolled past the workers. Now with a reinforced transmission and adjusted gear ratio, Marina tapped the turret, leaving a smear of grease. "Don't embarrass us," she whispered. The tank revved once and thundered out the doors. A visitor at dawn, the factory gates opened, and an armed convoy rolled in. A black ZS limousine. Inside sat Lavrenti Beria. Head of the NKVD, every worker stiffened. He walked the assembly floor silently, his polished boots untouched by the oil-slick mud. He looked at every machine, every tank hull, every worker's trembling hands. He paused beside Marina. "You weld these turrets?" "Yes, comrade," he leaned in. "Do not fail your country." She swallowed hard and nodded. Only after he left did she allow herself to breathe. That day, Tankograd broke its record. 41 completed tanks. The war machine was accelerating, but the Soviets were about to demand something far bigger, a machine so huge it would turn Tankograd into a legend. August 7, 1942, tank testing grounds, Chelyabinsk. The KV-1 prototype thundered across the frozen dirt like a runaway freight train, but today, something even larger loomed beside it, a new tower of steel. A turret so massive that workers joked it needed its own postal code. The KV-2. Its turret resembled a blockhouse from a fortress, square, towering almost comically oversized. Bolted into the turret was a 152mm howitzer, the kind normally dragged behind horses or trucks. Now it sat on a tank chassis. Looks like a barn stuck on a tractor, Ivan muttered. But when that gun fired, nobody laughed. The blast punched a shockwave through the field. Snow leapt into the air. Engineers staggered backward, clutching clipboards and hats. Inside the turret, the test crew was deafened by the blast. Pasha, acting as test driver again, yelled, "Did we hit it?" Marina, standing near the observation post with a pair of binoculars, lowered them slowly. The target bunker, 3 feet of reinforced concrete, now had a hole blown clean through the center. Smoke drifted from the shattered remains. It didn't hit it, she corrected softly. It erased it. Around them, guards, prisoners, engineers, even cynical foremen, stared with awe. The KV-2 was ugly. It was slow. It was absurd, but it was terrifying. Back inside Tankograd, faster, bigger, more production didn't slow down. The KV-1 and KV-2 lines ran side by side, metal monsters taking shape in the assembly hall. The factory echoed with the never-ending rhythm of steel. Hiss, slam, weld, grind. Marina walked the line, clipboard in hand, now promoted to line supervisor. Her boots crunched on the gritty mix of sand and metal filings beneath her feet. She paused beside a group of new teenage welders. "You're stacking weld too thick," she told one of them. "It adds weight. Grind it down to smooth the seam." The boy nodded nervously. "How many tanks today, comrade supervisor?" Marina glanced at her clipboard. 52. The boy's eyes widened. "Is that even possible?" Marina didn't blink. It has to be. She'd stopped believing in possible months ago. When the tanks slept, the people did not even during supposed sleeping hours. Tankograd never truly slept. At 3 a.m., the cafeteria was full. Bowls of cabbage water, bread like stone, crushed dreams everywhere. Teenagers drew schematics on napkins. Engineers argued over gear ratios while using bread crusts as demonstration pieces. Valentina sat at one of the long steel tables, shoulders sagging. Marina slid onto the bench beside her. "You're skipping sleep again." Valentina chuckled. "I'll sleep when we reach Berlin." "Sheer stubbornness won't win this war," Marina said. "Neither will naps," Valentina replied and stood. Her knees shaking, her determination was heroic, her exhaustion was lethal. Power failure, and the unthinkable solution. 2 days later, 1:14 a.m., a deafening silence fell across the factory floor. The assembly line stopped. Lights died. The welding torches sputtered out. For the first time in months, Tankograd was quiet. A blackout, Sergei Ginsburg sprinted across the floor. "What happened?" he shouted. A foreman yelled back, "Power station overload. Transformers are blown." "No power means no tanks," Ivan muttered. "No tanks means no Russia," Ginsburg snapped. A voice from the back shouted, "Generators." "We'll use generators." Marina shook her head. "Those generators can't power Assembly Hall 3. They barely power the offices." A dead silence fell over the hall. An idea formed, insane, but perfectly Soviet. Pasha shouted, "We have engines." Marina turned toward him, confused. "Engines?" Pasha smacked the side of a V2 diesel sitting on a pallet. "We build tanks powered by these engines. Let's use the engines to build tanks." Within minutes, dozens of workers wheeled 2 tank engines to the far corner of the hall. Cables were stripped and spliced. Fuel lines were rigged from steel drums. A welding crew improvised cooling hoses using wet burlap sacks. Even through the switch, the engines coughed, then roared to life. The assembly hall lit up. The welders cheered. Sparks flew. The tanks themselves were now powering the factory. Stalin's call at dawn. The director's phone rang. He answered, trembling. "This is Tankograd." A cold voice replied, "This is Stalin." Workers nearby froze. The director swallowed. "We increased output. We are delivering the KV-2, Stalin interrupted, voice flat and sharp. "Germany has launched Operation Blau. Our forces are retreating toward the Volga. You will triple production, and you will prepare to produce something even heavier." The director blinked. "Heavier than the KV-2? Stalin breathed one sentence into the receiver like a death sentence. "You will build the IS-2. The line went dead. The room fell silent. Ginsburg turned to the assembly crew. "You heard him. We start designs tomorrow." Marina felt her chest tighten. "How much heavier can we go?" she whispered. Ivan smirked grimly. "Enough to crush a city." Tankograd had built monsters. Now, it was ordered to build a legend. January 4th, 1943. Design Hall, Chelyabinsk. Tankograd snow hammered against the enormous factory windows as if trying to break its way inside. The storm outside howled. The storm inside was silent, focused, and human. Blueprints blanketed the long drafting tables. Pencils scratched. Sleeves were rolled up. Cigarettes burned down to filter and were replaced without pause. The name of the machine they were designing was written in thick black ink on the blueprint's corner. IS-2 Joseph Stalin Tank Ginsburg tapped the paper with his pencil. A 122mm gun. The biggest cannon ever mounted on a Soviet tank. Ivan raised an eyebrow. "And if it doesn't fit?" "It will fit," Ginsburg replied. "Even if we have to redesign the turret." Pasha walked past with a mug of watered-down coffee. "We're basically building a land battleship." Marina glanced up from her welding notes. "No," she said. "We're building revenge. Designed by war, testing under fire, the IS-2 prototype came together faster than anyone believed possible. The turret was massive, a thick cast of armor shaped like a gorilla's fist. Welders attacked it from all angles, sparks flying like angry fireflies. The 120mm barrel extended outward like a challenge. The first engine test shook the walls. The tank moved. Then came the real test. February 12, 1943. Field test range. Kilometers from Tankograd, snow crunched beneath boots as Marina, Ginsburg, and Ivan approached the firing position. The IS-2 prototype rumbled into place. Pasha climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the hatch. Ginsburg shouted over the wind, "Target, reinforced bunker. Distance 1,800 meters." The gunner loaded the massive shell. Everyone braced. Boom! The shockwave blasted across the range, knocking snow from pine trees. Marina shielded her face from the flying powder. A second later, the bunker, the exact type used by the Wehrmacht, had disintegrated. The shock tore through the concrete, blasting chunks into the air. No cheers. No applause. Just stunned silence, even whispered, voice trembling. "It could kill a tiger." Ginsburg stared at the smoking crater. It could kill fear. Production, grind. The price of Speed Tankograd turned itself inside out to produce the new design. Old KV-2 tooling was ripped from the floor and replaced by new stamping dies. The T-34 lines remained untouched. They ran around the clock. But the new hall, Assembly Line 7, belonged to the IS-2. Marina inspected turret seams while Valentina welded reinforcement plates. The two women worked side by side, helmets tilted down, weld arcs reflecting in their visors. The air tasted of ozone and hot metal. During a short break, Valentina's gloved hand shook as she reached for a cup of soup. Marina frowned. "You're burning out," Valentina smirked weakly. "Burning out means I'm still burning." Her hands never stopped trembling. Tragedy online. 7 March 3, 1943, 02:40 a.m. A shower of sparks suddenly turned into a growing flame. A welding fuel line ruptured. No one saw who dropped the torch, but within seconds a sheet of fire rolled across the shop floor. Valentina dove toward a rack of acetylene tanks. "Get away from there!" Marina screamed. Valentina ignored her, grabbing a half-welded turret shield and slamming it onto the leaking valves to choke the fire. The welders dragged her backward just as the fuel line burst. Heat blasted through the assembly line. For a long moment, everything was smoke and terror. When the flames died, Marina found Valentina leaning against a crate, coughing. Her glove had melted to her palm. "I saved the tanks," she whispered, voice raw. Marina pressed her forehead against hers. "You saved us." Valentina didn't return to work. She was hospitalized with burns and pneumonia, but every day, someone brought her a new production number to read. 40 IS-2s this week, 60 next week. Her smile never faded. Battle analysis arrives from the Eastern Front, April 1943. Tankograd briefing hall. Officers from the Stalingrad front arrived with field reports. They spread reconnaissance photos across a long table. Destroyed T-34s. KV-1s turned into smoking shells. A colonel tapped a photo of a German Tiger tank, still smoldering, with a hole clean through the turret. That shot was fired from an IS-2. He looked at Ginsburg. The front wants every IS-2 you can build. Ginsburg nodded. You'll have them. Mass production triumphs by summer 1943. Tankograd was operating beyond logic, beyond sanity. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No holidays, no excuses. The tank engines thundered so constantly that new workers eventually stopped noticing the noise. Snow outside never stuck to the roofs. The heat from the furnaces melted it instantly. The IS-2 rolled down the line, one after the other, like steel giants born from fire. Marina inspected a completed vehicle, running her fingers along the cold armor. Even slapped the turret proudly. These tanks won't just reach Berlin, they'll park on Hitler's doorstep. Pasha climbed into the driver's seat. Open the gates. The newest IS-2 roared forward, smashing through the fresh snow. A convoy of completed tanks waited outside, exhaust fumes swirling in the frigid air. Headlights pierced the dark. The final loading officer shouted, "Berlin awaits." The tanks rolled out one after another, engines roaring like thunder. Tankograd had built monsters. Now they were marching west. January 14, 1945. East Prussia. Pre-dawn. The forest shuddered as engines growled to life. A battalion of IS-2, heavy tanks, fresh from Tankograd, sat hidden under snow-covered firs. Their silhouettes were hulking and angular in the cold moonlight. Frost clung to their turrets. Diesel smoke mixed with the stinging scent of pine sap. Tank Commander Captain Viktor Sokolov stood on the turret of the lead IS-2, adjusting his headset. His breath rose like steam from a locomotive. "Driver," he said into the throat mic, "forward on my mark." In front of them lay a German position guarding a key road into East Prussia, one of the final barriers before the Red Army could begin its advance toward the Reich's heart. Behind Victor, the restlessness of the entire Eastern Front could be heard, boots crunching on hard snow, the clatter of rifles, the low murmur of artillery crews preparing their guns. Inside the IS-2, the loader, Sergeant Mikhail Rudikov, struggled to lift one of the massive 122mm shells. The interior smelled of metal and old sweat. He braced, muscles shaking, and shoved the shell into the breech. "Loaded," he called out. The gunner sighted in on the distant German bunker. "Target acquired." Victor inhaled sharply. This was what millions of hands at Tankograd had labored for. He imagined welders he would never meet. Men and women, teenagers, prisoners, burned hands, sleepless faces. People who stuck pieces of themselves to the steel through blood and exhaustion. He whispered, barely audible, "Это за них. This is for them." Fire. The cannon exploded, a streak of flame shot from the barrel. Snow vaporized, and the bunker disappeared in a cloud of pulverized concrete. The IS-2 lurched forward, leading the attack. Tankograd from afar, a city buried in steelback in Chelyabinsk. Tankograd didn't celebrate. It only worked. Marina stood on assembly line 7, clipboard under her arm, eyes fixed on the next turret seam. She hadn't slept in. She couldn't remember. The world had shrunk to steel plates and weld lines. Valentina's empty workstation sat like a ghost between welding stations. She had died in the hospital that winter, from exhaustion more than from burns. The workers held a moment of silence, 10 seconds. Then the machines switched back on, because the war wasn't over. Final winter. Push February 9th, 1945, the Oder River. The IS-2 column rolled across ice-covered roads. German Panthers fired from ambush positions, shells screeching through the frosty air. One Panther shell struck, Sokolov's IS-2. The Soviet tank shook violently, but held. The gunner responded. Boom! The Panther exploded. The IS-2s kept moving, all along the line. Soviet infantry cheered whenever they saw the hulking silhouettes, Tankograd. Tankograd sent us angels made of iron. Captain Sokolov didn't feel like an angel. Inside the turret, his ears rang and the heat was suffocating. But every time he fired, every time the tank lurched forward, he pictured workers far away in Chelyabinsk. Marina, Ivan, Ginsburg, Valentina. Every shell was their revenge. The last barrier, and a message. Home, April 21st, 1945, Berlin outskirts. Is2. Tanks crushed the bones of the city beneath their treads. Cobblestones, rubble, tram lines. Burning buildings cast orange light across the streets, making the tanks appear like mythical beasts. German soldiers, once arrogant conquerors, fled from the sound of the 122mm gun. Captain Sokolov's tank rounded a ruined corner. Ahead stood a reinforced SS barricade, sandbags, machine guns, mortar nests, desperate and final. Sokolov radioed the crew, gunner. "Let's end this," and loaded. He paused. In that second, his chest tightened. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper, browned by sweat, folded and unfolded 100 times. A note from Chelyabinsk. Is2, 431, welded by Marina Petrova, supervised by Ginsburg, built with pride. He pressed the note to the turret wall. Fire. The barricade evaporated. Berlin trembled. Hours later, Soviet troops reached the Reich Chancellery. A red banner flew. The war, after 4 years of blood, steel, and production, was ending. Chelyabinsk hears the news May 9th, 1945, Tankograd. The announcement crackled over the factory loudspeakers. Germany has surrendered. Victory is ours. For the first time in years, the machines fell silent. No engines, no presses, no welders, just silence. Workers stared at one another, unsure what to do now that the impossible had been achieved. Marina set down her welding mask. Her hands shook. Ivan sat on a crate and cried openly, shamelessly. Ginsburg walked to the giant main gate of the factory and shut off the floodlights. One by one, the assembly halls fell dark. Tankograd slept. Legacy, and the question left behind. In the months that followed, many workers returned to their old cities. Some found ruins, some found graves. Valentina's portrait was hung on the wall of Assembly Line 7. Marina visited it every morning before work. She stayed at Tankograd because she no longer knew how to live without the sound of engines. Tankograd continued building tanks for decades, but none would ever matter more than the ones built during those brutal winters, because those weren't just machines. They were the will of a nation turned into steel. City that wasn't on any map changed the course of history, and every time an Is2 rolled toward Berlin, the echo of Tankograd followed it. The hammer of the press, the hiss of the welding torch, the heartbeat of a factory that refused to die. They didn't just build tanks, they built victory.